and she would gladly get you the information. You will be featured on our Facebook page, on our LinkedIn, and you get to talk a little bit at one of our meetings. Next up is our treasurer's report. Most of you should have that on your table, so if everyone wants to take a look. Unfortunately, our treasurer is not able to be here today, but you can see where our checking account balance sits towards the end of December. We're right around $6,000. We're a little bit ahead of last year. We do have the donations that we paid out for 2020, and then some of the current ones, which for really December, we donated to the Oshkosh Chamber Foundation. John and Rob spoke last meeting, so we're doing our speaker donation for them. And then one thing that you won't see on here, which is kind of one of our new business, so I'll just jump ahead, but as a West Side organization, we heard there was a need with the Oshkosh CVB regarding their Love Oshkosh campaign, and they ran out of some hats to give out. It was a very popular campaign, so I don't know, Amy, if you want to kind of fill us in on what that campaign was.
Yes, so this is exciting because these hats have been, this is the last hat like this that exists in the world right now as we know it. Somebody here is walking away with this. That's the excitement. I was like Oprah, like somebody gets a hat. Okay, and then this is the second most popular hat, which there are a few of these left, but it's still equally amazing. So we did a campaign called Stay Safe, Love Local, and we basically gave a challenge. We started on Small Business Saturday and went through Christmas Eve and gave people in Oshkosh the challenge to spend $100. And when they spent $100 locally, they uploaded their receipts and they got one of these hats. Now, and if any of you know me, you know that I'm very excitable and ambitious, and so I got really excited about this and never really looked through the details of like how we were going to distribute 700 hats, which is what we ended up going through. So Tony, wave at her over there, she and the Oshkar became a fulfillment house because of COVID. We have a pretty small staff right now, so we delivered hats all over the town. We did mail them out if they were from out of town. But the receipts that came in were well over $100,000 that we generated in local spending. The biggest one was an engagement ring that was a receipt for over $10,000 to Dream Jewelers. And I was hoping they didn't want more than one hat because the way our rules work, they only still got one hat. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of sad. But it was a really great campaign. And what's exciting is West Side Association has stepped up to sponsor 200 more hats. So now we are actually working on how we're going to re-roll this out, which hopefully will be next week. We didn't want to just go on Facebook and say, oh, we have some more hats. We wanted to give West Side a little bang for their buck. And along with this, we are featuring local businesses, everything from, people can spend the money at restaurants, they can spend it at retail, they can spend it at their hair salon, whatever. So it's really looking all across the board. And of course, we look at it as hospitality, but at the end of the day, local spending is local spending. So really thankful to have this. These did come from Fort Imprint, another local vendor who did a really nice job of giving us a great deal on these. And so we were able to kind of stretch those dollars even further. So I don't know how to give these away, so you have to.
Maybe I mean like a birthday.
Yeah, yes,
like somebody has a birthday.
Yes.
Does anybody have a birthday this week?
Oh, and then one other thing there, along with this campaign, we do have masks because, this is the exciting hot item in COVID time. So I'll just put these over by the door, and if anybody would like one, just please take one. So, thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Actually, I'll come up here to switch things over.
So as a West Side Association, our board voted to donate the funds in order to do 100 more women's hats and 100 more men's hats. So that is one of the line items that you'll see under new business. So happy to help continue to support the community. And if there's no questions on the treasurer's report, we will move on to the chamber report. John.
All right. Thanks, Rachel. A lot of stuff going on in January. This week we kind of took the week off a little bit because coming back from the holidays is kind of a slow time for, well, it's a fast time for people, but they're just trying to get their heads screwed back on and getting back to work. But next week we start in earnest with a lot of programming. A couple things of note. Annual meeting for the chamber is going to be on the 28th of January. It's going to be virtual, not our desired way to do an annual meeting, but so there'll be no cocktails and all that stuff. But if you want to drink during the noon hour, go right ahead. We're not necessarily doing that, but it's an opportunity for Javad Ahmad, who is our past chairman, to talk about this past year. It's been an interesting year. I mean, they say timing is everything, and he pulled the short straw and got it this past year, which and he did a great job in terms of leading the organization and that sort of thing. And it's also an opportunity for our incoming chairman, who's currently our chairman, Wilson Jones, with Oshkosh Corp, to kind of outline the challenge for the upcoming year. So tune into. Tune into that. If you could register in advance, that'd be great. If not, we'll still be sending out links for everybody to listen in on it. And it seems like a lot of people are looking to participate in that. Next week we have OC Connection is starting up again on the 12th, and then we're continuing our what we call bite-sized learning programming. That's becoming a person of influence, how to positively impact others. We've been working with Angela Bergstrom with Step Into Humility. She's been doing a lot of programming for us over the last couple of months, and does a great job. If anybody's ever tuned in on those are very good programs for us. On the 14th, also next Thursday, we're doing our annual State of the Community address. We usually do that before our annual Business Expo at the end of January, but it's not happening this year. And so we're doing it virtually. We got Mark Boloff, City Manager. We got Mark Harris, County Executive. Vicki Cartwright with the Oshkosh Area School District. Deb Heath with Fox Valley Tech, and Chancellor Andy Levitt talking about hopefully not just COVID stuff, but talking about what's on the agenda for all those organizations in the upcoming year. It's been they still have their businesses to do and to run, so hopefully it'll be insightful. Social Hub again is starting up for the winter spring session. Tuesday, January 19th, we got Chris Burns with Be Connected, who's going to be talking about social media trends in 2021, so we'll be looking for that. We have our monthly breakfast briefing with HR briefings that we're doing. This one is going to be on the upcoming the COVID-19 relief bill and what employers need to know about that as they go into the it's a new year, and Tony will probably be talking about some of that stuff today too. So leading from the top is going to be kickstarting again. That's something we've been doing with differentiating strategies. Joe Thompson and also Vicki Updike lead those, and those are for CEO kind of owner individuals and high-level managers who talk about strategic kind of issues relating to their businesses. And this one we're talking this series this session we're talking about confrontation. So I'm good at that.
They do a good job. I attended their sessions. Yes. They do a good job.
And then we have the folks from AIB Systems on the 10th of February coming in, how to leverage the new tech to bring back your workforce safely. So but that was timely. We're bringing back the project management series. We just did that in fall, very successful, and we're going to be kicking that off again in February. So we're running February, March time frame. And then lastly, Brian Ballou is coming back to us for our Economic Outlook event. No breakfast involved this time. It'll be virtual, but it starts at 8 o'clock on the 9th of February. If anybody who's seen Brian, I think you can attest he's outstanding. I think we've had him 12 years in a row now. And so it'll be an interesting presentation from him about what he sees this upcoming year is going to be. And then he's got some explaining to do as to what happened last year. So, but that one we're charging for those for that one. So it's $30 for an individual ticket, and it's $250 for a package of 10. So if you are interested in that, please register in advance so we get your link out. So That's it. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And Dan, the thing with Dan, follow him around because he will buy you coffee. Whenever I'm at Big Apple Bagel, he's there, it's coffee on Dan, so it's.
Allegedly, don't talk about that. Allegedly. We don't talk about that stuff.
We all need a damn shit in our lives.
We don't talk about Opus chocolates, we don't talk about.
You do oat chocolate?
We do. We just did it tonight.
All right.
Save your receipts, you
Silent over.
Thanks, John. Nothing too much for old business, new business. We do have the developers panel coming up, so we will not have our regular monthly meeting in February, but we will have our developers panel on the 23rd. We are working on securing some of our developers. We have confirmed Steve Davis, who will be talking about Barney and Ed's. And then we have Karen Schneider, who will be moderating for us again this year. So it will be a great event. So please mark your calendars down for February 23rd. This is a morning meeting, so this will start at 7:30. And it will be, we're planning on having it here at Lashers. So any additional questions on that, watch for additional information to come, our Facebook, LinkedIn. And then these Love Oshkosh. Does anybody have a birthday in January? Any birthdays in January? No? February. Okay. Oh, look at that right there. Sean, Nancy, Joe. You'll each get a hat. All right, so today we've got Tony Renning, who is an attorney with Strang, Pattinson, Redding, Lewis, and Lacey. And Tony concentrates his practice in labor and employment, as well as school law, litigation, and counseling. He provides advice and counsel to employers about their rights and obligations under federal and state laws and regulations. He advises on all aspects of labor and employment compliance, including wage and hour, leave of absence, discrimination, harassment, reductions in force, workforce management, employment policies and handbooks, as well as other employment-related matters. Tony also has significant experience with labor negotiations, union certification and decertification campaigns, unfair labor practice litigation, and contract administration, including grievance arbitration. He regularly represents clients before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, National Labor Relations Board, Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development, and Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission. In addition, he conducts employment-related training for management. His primary client base includes private and public employers of all sizes. And Tony is also very involved in a lot of different community organizations. So please join me in welcoming Tony Renning.
Thank you. It was pretty cool. I got the invitation to speak, and I took a look at the date, and it said January 7th, and then I saw the information where Chick-fil-A was opening today, and thought, well, nobody's going to come and hear anything about labor and employment.
Tony, my son just sent me pictures. He's in a big, long line.
So we're all better off for not being in that line.
There you go.
I don't know, in a half an hour, you can tell me if you're better off after listening to all of this. So, the other good part about this is it's in person. So for the last 9 months or so, all of the programs that I've done have been by Zoom or whatever the medium is. But you get a little bit concerned giving these programs or presentations. And you look out there into the abyss of everybody shuts off their picture. Is anybody actually listening or not? So it's kind of nice to see faces, to see smiles, even to see you, Dan. I mean, and then, so of course, yesterday comes along, and I'm kind of finalizing, putting together the materials, and thinking to myself, oh boy, this is going to be an interesting presentation and an interesting time. And so from that perspective, what I'm going to share with you, I put materials at everybody's table so we can kind of talk through them. I'm not taking a position on, whether these are good things or bad things. I'll maybe editorialize a little bit. But for the most part, I took all of these positions from the Biden-Harris campaign materials. And so that's what I'm sharing as their position and where they intend to go with this and some of the things that we need to look out for from a labor and employment perspective. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about the change in Washington. We'll just describe it as a mess right now. We've got less than 2 weeks, so 2 weeks from yesterday, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will become the 46th president and vice president of the United States. And I guess the biggest change happened within the last day or so with regard to the congressional makeup. The House of Representatives remains in the control of the Democrats, and Nancy Pelosi will continue to be the Speaker of the House. But the Senate, with the runoff elections in Georgia, resulted in a 50-50 tie now. And that means Kamala Harris, as the Vice President, will have the say with respect to breaking those ties at the U.S. Senate. And what that means is probably Joe Manchin, Senator from West Virginia, Democratic Senator from West Virginia, probably becomes one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, D.C. He tends to be a little bit more from a conservative standpoint, even though he is a Democrat. But, as we talk about some of these issues and some of the plans moving forward, he's going to play a big role in whether or not these get rolled out and how much the Senate decides to really move forward. Couple of things with regard to the recent change, and again, this might be editorializing a little bit, but I think with the results of the election in Georgia, maybe the biggest concern or the biggest issue moving forward is for small business. I think the outlook with the pandemic was rough enough as it was, but for small business folks moving forward, they were at least maybe relying on or counting on divided government in Washington. And now that doesn't look to be the case. I think there is some concern for small business. There are going to be the potential for increased tax hikes, the possibility for public option with regard to health insurance benefits, energy, Green New Deal type of things with regard to the environment, and then labor regulations and how that's going to ultimately impact employers as well. And so, there are two things in Washington. We've got the budget reconciliation. So with regard to tax hikes and those types of issues, that was something that 51 votes in the U.S. Senate was going to be able to decide regardless. President-elect Biden has proposed an increase of approximately $3.3 trillion to the U.S. budget from a tax standpoint. He's proposing to increase individual and corporate income taxes. And that's something that the Senate can take up. And as long as they have 51 votes, they would be able to pass those tax increases along to the public. And assuming again that the House, which is a very narrow majority for the Democrats, but ultimately supports that, and that President Biden then would ultimately sign off on that legislation as well. The bigger issue is with regard to a lot of these other issues I talked about, the public option, the Green New Deal, some of the labor issues. In order to pass those laws, the Senate is going to have to address the filibuster issue and getting to 60 votes, whether or not the Senate will take up that issue. And, in a lot of cases, the former Senate Majority Leader McConnell didn't bring a lot of these issues before the Senate. Now I think that's one of the things that will change is you're going to see the Senate Majority Leader Schumer bring these issues forward. And Senator Schumer has already indicated that he is willing to do away with the filibuster. And so it will be interesting to see what the rest of the Senate decides to do with respect to that, because if that filibuster goes away, again, then we're in a situation where we only need the 51 votes in order to have change with regard to the Green New Deal, the labor regulations, the public option with regard to health insurance and those types of things. So it's an important thing to keep an eye on. The other thing with regard to that is the Congressional Review Act, which the Senator Schumer has indicated will be one of the first items he takes up. And essentially, the act is intended to do away with all of the executive mandates or directions that the Trump administration has imposed. So, good or bad, whatever those, impacts were on business, one of the first things is to basically wipe the slate clean and to do away with all of those executive mandates or directives. If we take a look at the potential changes moving forward here, I've identified basically by group. So we're looking at OSHA, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, National Labor Relations Board, the Department of Labor, all of those types of groups that will have an impact on labor and employment issues moving forward. And I guess, I'll say it now at the front and probably wrap up with it as well. As I was starting to put together these materials, and I forewarned, all of us as small business owners that, maybe the future here, at least the short-term future, there might be some cause for concern from a legal standpoint, from a labor and employment attorney standpoint. These times are going to be pretty cool. So I guess
Making money.
Yeah, making money.
Making money.
So there's one of us in the room that might be looking forward to this. Of course, you take it from one pocket.
Spending money.
Yeah.
Spending money.
Give it to the other. So what we can expect though with respect to OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is that there's going to be increased enforcement. We've seen the calls for this, especially in light of the pandemic. So calls for the OSHA to enforce requirements with regard to protective equipment, implementing administrative controls like social distancing, scheduling employees, so circulating them through so that you don't have a workplace that's as full as it normally would be, requiring employees, if they don't need to necessarily be at the workplace, to work from home, sanitation and housekeeping skills, so mandatory cleaning, sanitizing workstations, washing hands, all of those types of things, employee training, with regard to how you can, avoid being at risk of contracting the virus. There are going to be obligations to report to OSHA on a more consistent basis as to when individuals come down with the virus, how employers are handling their protocols and procedures, those types of things. Engineering controls, so putting in place requirements on employers that they have, air movement or those types of engineering things in place so that the virus can't spread at the workplace. And then the treatment of time off for employees, if they're quarantining or if they're because they've been exposed or if they ultimately come down with the virus as well. In addition to those kind of temporary fixes and temporary issues that we can probably expect to see come down pretty quickly after January 20th. There is also going to be an increase in the number of OSHA inspectors and enforcement personnel. The president-elect has indicated that he would like to spend a significant amount of money to beef up those particular areas. So we're going to see more OSHA inspectors getting out and about and checking out workplace facilities and then responding to employee concerns about the virus and those types of things, and ultimately the enforcement mechanisms that will be put in place. One thing that's been a hot topic is employer liability or immunity from liability with regard to COVID. It was one of the bargaining points with regard to any of the care packages or the stimulus packages that have been proposed. The Democrats have been opposed to providing any sort of immunity for employer liability, whereas the Republicans have been pushing that we need to be able to have this moving forward. I wouldn't anticipate that there will be any employer immunity from liability moving forward. So OSHA's, again, going to increase their enforcement. They're going to increase their penalties and all of those types of things. And employers are going to be the ones feeling the brunt of those, not only those claims, but making sure that they adhere to all of the protocols and requirements that are in place up front. Mandatory face covering requirement. I would anticipate that we're going to see something like this on a short-term basis. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to be enforced as of yet. I mean, we saw what happened with respect to the state and their mandatory requirement, but I think we can all anticipate that the federal government will try and impose some sort of mandatory face covering requirement. With regard to vaccinations, that's been the biggest issue, and whether or not employers can require employees to get the COVID-19 vaccination. And I think for the most part, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has come out with its guidance recently, and I wouldn't expect a big change with respect to that guidance moving forward as we move forward with the Biden administration. And essentially the EEOC is saying that employers can mandate vaccination as a continuing obligation, well, as a condition of employment or as a condition of continuing employment, but there have to be certain exceptions. Those exceptions apply in situations where somebody has a disability and they can't take the vaccination, or where they have a strongly held religious belief. So the ADA and Title VII will provide some exceptions to employees having to take the vaccination. It has to be job related, meaning that the EEOC's basis for imposing the requirement on employees is that it would impose, that there would be a direct threat to individuals coming to work if they didn't take the vaccination, or it would have a direct effect on those people that they interact with. So certainly in the retail business, you know, where we're talking about restaurants or sales and those types of things, where there's a lot of interaction, there is that direct threat, and so that job relatedness. But in a manufacturing setting or in some other situations where there isn't a whole lot of interaction between people, it may be a little bit tougher for employers to impose a vaccination requirement. And the same thing, it's, you know, consistent with business necessity. So, John?
What happens if an employer imposes that, it makes that mandatory, and that individual gets a negative reaction from that vaccination? Who's liable on that deal?
Yeah, so this is where the employer is not going to receive any liability or immunity from liability under the OSHA, like we just talked about. Similarly, if an employer doesn't require the vaccination and there's a direct threat or something along those lines, the employer, there's the thought anyway, that the employer is going to be held liable. I think with respect to the question that you raised, where, you know, we require as an employer that somebody get that vaccination and they have an adverse effect, I think the employer is, you know, going to be on the hook for that. We're not going to see any immunity from liability with respect to that as well. So essentially what it comes down to, though, is encouragement versus requirement. I think that's kind of the advice that I've given to most employers, is to encourage employees to get the vaccination, to do what they need to do to follow the protocols to stay safe and to keep others safe, as opposed to implementing requirements, at least at this point in time. With regard to the COVID-19 relief that exists out there right now, we have the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and the protections of emergency paid sick leave and the extended family medical leave. Those both expired as of December 31st for employers with less than 500 employees. However, with the most recent legislation that passed, that's been extended, at least on an optional basis. Employers can continue to provide emergency paid sick leave and extended family medical leave to employees through March 31st of 2021, and they can still avail themselves then of the tax credit that's available, provided that the individuals who exercise their rights to get those emergency paid sick leave and extended family medical leave act rights after or during that time period haven't already utilized the 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave or the up to the $10,000 in reimbursement under the emergency or the extended family medical leave act. We also saw an extension with regard to the health insurance and healthcare costs associated with it, again through March 31st of 2021. Those are still available. through March 14th of 2021. The unemployment insurance benefits, the $300 will be in effect there. And then the stimulus payments that have been going out. Again, Senator Schumer has indicated that as soon as he's able to do so, the Senate will take up the $2,000 stimulus checks as opposed to the $600 stimulus checks that are out there, and we'll move or try to move forward with those $2,000 stimulus payments. Some of the changes then that are coming along with respect to some of the other agencies. Department of Labor, some new overtime or minimum wage requirements. If you'll recall, prior to the Trump administration, or just prior to the Trump administration, the Obama administration had proposed changing the salary threshold numbers for individuals with respect to their exemption for purposes of receiving overtime. And the result was to, or the proposal at that time was to increase the threshold from $23,660 to $47,476. The result would be that a lot more individuals would be entitled to overtime compensation under the salary threshold test. They didn't address the duties test, which addresses the various responsibilities that individuals have and whether or not they're exempt because of the duties they perform. There doesn't seem to be any push to address the duties test. The Trump administration did increase the threshold minimally from $23,660 to $35,568, but the belief is that President-elect Biden will try and reenact or implement the push from Obama to up that number to $47,476, again, to include more individuals or allow more individuals to be eligible for overtime pay. There's also a belief, or at least in the materials that were presented, that President-elect Biden will make a push from a federal minimum wage standpoint to increase that from $7.25 to $15 an hour. Yeah, you're all, you all know what the impact of that, or the potential impact of that could be as well. President-elect Biden, with regard to the Department of Labor, wage and hour issues, is also proposing to be more aggressive with regard to wage and hour enforcement. And let me just tell you, from just example right now, I mean, we've had 4 years of a little bit of deregulation with regard to wage and hour enforcement. But let me tell you about the nightmares of dealing with this. So you get a claim, you have an employee who makes a claim for a wage and hour issue. They weren't paid a certain amount of overtime, or they weren't paid as an hourly employee. And it was because of a deal that you cut on the side, or whatever the case may have been. My favorite saying, no good deed goes unpunished. But in a lot of cases, you have employees that come to you and say, hey, I don't want to work overtime. I don't need to collect the overtime. Just pay me regularly. Just pay me a salary basis, whatever the case may be. And you agree to do that. And then something goes south. And all of a sudden, you get a wage and hour complaint. And unfortunately, all too recently, I've seen too many of these complaints where we're talking about $1,500, $2,000, $2,500, $5,000 worth of damages. And, from an employer standpoint, that's bad enough that you got to reach into your pocket and pay that. But when these folks go out and hire an attorney on the other side, now we're responsible for attorney's fees. And that's where the big numbers are. So these claims where I'm talking about, we've resolved or settled these claims for $1,500 in damages, $2,000 in damages. We're paying $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 in attorney's fees on the other side. And so with this push by the president-elect to be more aggressive with regard to this enforcement, just be careful with your employee handbooks and provisions with regard to wage and hour issues, and the deals that you may cut, or the agreements that you reach with employees moving forward. Another big change is under the Obama administration, they had done away with wage and hour opinion letters. And the opinion letter is a good thing from an employer perspective. You're looking at implementing a new policy, you're implementing something, and so you ask the Department of Labor to weigh in on it and to give you an idea as to whether or not it's something that's going to violate the rules and regulations. And again, up until the Obama administration had taken over, Department of Labor would issue these letters, and as long as you adhered to whatever the result of the letter was, you as an employer then were exempt from any sort of penalties moving forward. Well, the Obama administration did away with the letter, the Trump administration brought the letters back, and President-elect Biden has indicated that he wants to do away with these opinion letters moving forward. So it's going to be more trial and error on the employer standpoint moving forward. We saw a new rule come down yesterday from the Department of Labor with respect to classifying independent contractors versus employees. This is important. And really, there had been, a 7-factor test, a 14-factor test, a lot of confusion as to who was an independent contractor, who was an employee, and ultimately they boiled it down yesterday. This rule will go into effect on March 8th of 2021, but look for changes again, potentially coming down. But essentially, they boiled that down to 2 factors. What control does an individual have to perform on a day-to-day basis their job? And also, what is the risk for profit and loss? And again, if an individual has a lot of discretion to decide how they're going to do their job on a day-to-day basis and to either make a profit or make a loss, they're going to be identified as an independent contractor and therefore not subject to a lot of the wage and hour requirements, labor requirements, whatever the case may be with respect to employees. Another thing where we're going to see a potential change is with respect to joint employers. The joint employer rule had been kind of narrowed so that an individual, in the past, an individual working for somebody but simultaneously providing benefits to somebody else, both employers or both entities could ultimately be on the hook. And over time, the Department of Labor said that's not exactly right. And so they did away with that and said, who is it that is primarily benefiting from this? And so they narrowed that joint employer. Look for that potentially to change and to move away from that as well. We're going to see a big change with regard to immigration practices and policies. The restrictions on travel, President Trump had imposed restrictions, limits on who could come into the country from, I think, 13 countries. Look for President-elect Biden to do away with that. There were limited green cards that were out there, green cards that were available. Again, look for President-elect Biden to do away and with those limitations. Same thing with regard to DACA and to other worker programs. Specifically the H-1B visa. We've seen a lot of debate, discussion over that as to bringing foreigners into the country, requiring them to have certain degrees or be able to work in certain areas so that we were protecting American jobs and American employees. And there were some complaints or concerns from employers because they weren't able to fill these particular positions and there were caps on the number of H-1B visas. But for the most part, we've seen it work. But look for those caps and those limitations to be removed with regard to the H-1B visa. Same thing with regard to permanent employment-based visas. The cap was, I think, about 140,000 per year. Look for President-elect Biden to eliminate that cap and to allow for more. Worksite enforcement. We saw an increase with regard to undocumented employees and those employers that continue to employ undocumented employees, where the INS would go and raid or inspect facilities. President-elect Biden has indicated that he would like to terminate those raids or those enforcement practices from taking place and moving forward. So ultimately, from that perspective, anyway, there are going to be some big changes with regard to immigration and who can legally then work in the United States. From the National Labor Relations Board standpoint, some big changes or potential changes coming down. When President Obama was elected, there was a lot of concern that we were going to see big labor and their efforts to support him allowing for the labor unions to be able to gain power again, easier elections, those types of things, more protections for union employees. That maybe didn't play out as much back then. Now what we're seeing is the potential for what's called the Protecting the Rights to Organize Act. And this is a change, a pretty significant change to the National Labor Relations Act, which governs the employment of organized labor. And so moving forward, what we're going to see is potentially an increase in the fines that employers would face. $50,000 civil fine for a labor violation, for example, means something along those lines. Having something in your handbook, for example, that would preclude some employees from having a discussion about terms or conditions of employment, or at least being interpreted as that, could result in a $50,000 fine, and that could be crippling to a smaller business. Expanding the definition of employee, again, so allowing for more individuals to be covered by labor contracts and by the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. When we get to elections, the union will come asking for information as to who to contact and how they can contact those individuals, removing any sort of obstacles or roadblocks to providing that information, so requiring employers to provide that information, prohibiting mandatory arbitration. We just saw a big Supreme Court case come down a little over a year ago involving Epic Systems down in Madison, where they were able to win the right to have employees enter into mandatory arbitration agreements with regard to wage and hour disputes. And under the circumstances here, now the National Labor Relations Act would be modified to overcome that. So all of those would be subject to a grievance, or would be subject to potentially having the labor unions get involved. Expanding whistleblower protection laws, weakening right to work laws like we have here in Wisconsin, or like that has been adopted here in Wisconsin. So one of the big features with regard to Wisconsin law is that employees cannot be forced to pay union dues under this PRO Act. Potentially, now it will go back or revert to the fact that employees would be required to pay not only union dues, but maybe fair share dues if they didn't ultimately join the union. There's a provision in there talking about preventing employers from replacing permanently employees who strike based on an economic basis. Right now, if employees strike based on an unfair labor practice, you can't permanently replace them, but this would expand that to basically cover any employees who are involved in a strike. And then the last one here, reduce the amount of time for elections. So, if the union comes in and decides that they want to organize in a place, right now there are certain timelines in place that would allow the employer to respond and the employer to provide information so the employees can make an informed decision. Essentially, the PRO Act would eliminate or shorten up that time frame, so it would be a quickie election, so that the only information essentially that's out there is the information that's provided by the labor organization, and that would ultimately support then the employees voting to move to a union. There are also concerns about significant changes to some of the board decisions, or recent board decisions that are out there. The first one I have identified here is the Caesars Entertainment. The board recently said that employees do not have an automatic right to use their employer's electronic mail systems to engage in labor functions. And so that would be one that would probably be up right away for possible rescission. The second one is Boeing Company, a decision that came down. I talked a little bit about these handbook provisions, and we saw a big rise over the last few years in employees and in unions bringing Section 7 rights, arguing that employee handbooks, if they weren't written specifically, potentially violated individual Section 7 rights. And so the board took a look at this and modified the standard to be used in judging whether the employee handbooks violated an individual's Section 7 rights. And under the circumstances, it was a big win for employers, especially for small business, who doesn't have a whole lot of time to, invest in employee handbooks and making sure that they're changing all the time with regard to everything that happens. But this would be one, again, that would be up for rescission. Johnson Controls, this is a situation where the board recently ruled that if a labor contract expires, and the employer can come forward with objective evidence or proof that the union no longer is supported by a majority of the workplace, that the employer then can withdraw its recognition of the union, and instead of having to go through the decertification process. Again, this would be another situation where the board's decision would be looking to be rescinded. And then finally, these micro units, so the rescission of micro units. So the union would come in and normally you have to have a community of interest. For example, let's take the schools. All teachers would have a community of interest, or all support staff, whether it be aides or custodians or whatever the case may be, but they're all part of a group. And if you allow certain parts of that, special ed aides versus regular education aides, for example, the numbers get pretty small, and it allows the union then to impact the outcome of that vote, and generally supports unionization. So the board has recently done away with those micro units, but we could see rescission of that as well. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, dealing with discrimination standpoints, we can expect to see a more employee-friendly EEOC, and I say that tongue firmly planted in my cheek because it's been a pretty employee-friendly EEOC as it is, even under the Trump administration. But some of the things that we're going to see is more interaction between the agencies. So the EEOC working with the IRS, with the Department of Labor, with the National Labor Relations Board. So whenever there's a claim or an issue filed there, the EEOC is also going to get involved and investigate. We're going to see more claims of sexual harassment investigated, and ultimately enforcement of those. We'll also see an enforcement or a focus on LGBTQ rights and employee issues there. With regard to pay equity, I'm not saying that it's the Paycheck Fairness Act, that it's necessarily a bad thing, but there are some aspects or components of that legislation that do raise some concerns. An employer's ability to ask questions or to inquire about what your prior pay was with your prior employer, not being able to do that, not being able to look at making those comparisons as you hire individuals. Under the Obama administration, they had required that employers were going to be required to collect information with regard to gender, race, and ethnicity, and then to report that information. And again, from an enforcement standpoint, I understand where the EEOC is coming from. The problem is that information becomes public, and in today's cancel culture, the possibility exists that, this information falls into the wrong hands or is used for the wrong purposes moving forward. So anyway, we'll see probably a trend to go back to that, where employers are now going to be required to collect that information and then to ultimately report that information. We'll see more class actions coming forward, and also the burden of proof being changed from an employee obligation to prove that they were discriminated against to the employer almost being having an obligation to prove that there was no discrimination, or that they didn't engage in anything. From an employment standpoint, a lot of employers utilize non-competes and no poaching agreements or non-solicitation agreements. President-elect Biden has indicated his desire to do away with non-competes, except in those circumstances where an employer can absolutely show that the sharing of trade secrets or confidential information would result in an issue, and also with regard to non-solicitation agreements. So again, from an employer standpoint, you're bringing somebody in, you're teaching them all about your business, you're giving them access to your clients and your customers and all of those types of things. And now potentially the federal government is telling you that you can't protect those protect your rights or protect the ability to have those individuals go someplace else. The next one, President-elect Biden is going to strengthen apprenticeship programs and workforce training. Probably good things with regard to that. Employee or employer sponsored retirement plans. This is one that's kind of slipped a little bit under the radar. The Trump administration had really worked to deregularize the retirement plans, and President-elect Biden is looking to, again, regulate these plans. So first and foremost would be ending the tax breaks for employees who contribute to 401k plans. So in essence, what President-elect Biden is trying to do here is to provide less of an incentive for those folks who make more money to utilize the 401k, and to provide a tax credit at the end of the year so that lower and middle income folks are utilizing these benefits as well. One of the other avenues that President-elect Biden is looking at is requiring employers to provide this benefit. And for those employers out there who may match, but having a matching requirement or allowing employees to get involved in these types of activities. Support for the Butch-Lewis Act. This is really, again, at big labor. A lot of their pension plans are underfunded or in big trouble. So the Butch-Lewis Act would allow for loans so that those plans could be, those plans that are underfunded could now be funded. Another change we see coming down or proposed under the president-elect would be with regard to Social Security contributions. So right now, we all make our contributions up to $142,800. Then there would be a donut, and there wouldn't be any increase until you hit $400,000 in income. And at that point, those employees would be taxed at a 12.4% Social Security rate. However, they wouldn't be entitled to any additional benefits moving forward. So that's a concern. There's also a proposed tax with regard to the selling of securities. So, those of us that have 401ks, every time we move something from one fund to another or whatnot, that would get taxed, and, limit the, options that are available with respect to that. We're hearing about the increase or potential increase in the individual income tax from 37% to 39.6%. We talked a little bit about that, how that can happen under budget reconciliation, just with 51 votes in the Senate. A big change with regard to drug laws, so legalization of marijuana, kind of rescheduling the drug, allowing for more medicinal use of marijuana, and expunging prior marijuana convictions. So those are all things that are on the agenda for President-elect Biden. A few things just on the last page about what may not change immediately. Then we can open it up for any questions that we're 1 o'clock here, so I just want to be respectful of everybody's time too. But a couple of things with regard to the EEOC, at least. They have a strategic plan that was implemented in 2018, and it continues through 2022. That plan will remain in place, and so that's going to guide the EEOC. The majority of the commissioners at the EEOC are also Republican at this time, and that won't change until the middle of 2022. So internally, it may take a little while before we see some of those changes. We talked about OSHA and the emphasis on enforcement. That's not going to change. What's going to change is the amount of enforcement and the different areas that they're going to take a look at given the pandemic. Department of Labor, again, they're investigating and litigating where necessary, wage and hour claims now, but what we're going to see is, again, a focus on that and more litigation and more enforcement moving forward. And with regard to the National Labor Relations Board, the same thing. The board is composed of 5 members. Right now, there are 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat, 1 unfilled seat. So when President-elect Biden takes office, we'll see that Democrat seat filled. It'll be a 3-2. The president also has the authority to designate who the chair is. So that will move from a Republican to a Democrat, but the majority will still be Republican at least through August of 2021. So we won't see maybe a whole lot of changes on the board, at least for the next 8 or 9 months. But after that, that's kind of where we get into the situation that I talked about with some of these decisions and some of the impacts that it's going to have on labor and employment.
What about capital gains?
Well, that's a little bit out of my league, Gary, so, at least from a labor and employment standpoint, so. If I gave you tax advice, I'd be committing malpractice.
Nice cover.
Yeah.
So if you had to build it, would you sell it now or later? Personally,
Yeah,
not professionally.
yeah, well, I think it depends what business you're in right now, right, so, but, yeah. Some of these concerns with regard to small business and whatnot, I mean, I think you have to take seriously and be prepared for.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Tony, do you think that, to your knowledge, are they gonna be exemptions for 50 employees or less for some of these regulations? Is there gonna be a step program for like 50, 150, 500?
Yeah, I don't think so, Dan. I mean, with some of these, you have the numbers already in place, Family Medical Leave Act, and you have to have so many employees and the federal regulations and rules are still gonna have those. Where they're in existence, I think they're going to remain in existence. But otherwise, with regard to Green New Deal and those energy efficiency things, the public option with regard to health insurance, I don't think there are gonna be a whole lot of restrictions placed on those.
What about, you mentioned workman's comp for COVID and some of the other stuff?
Yeah.
Is that gonna be charged to us? Is that's gonna hit our EMR? Do you know anything, is it gonna hit our EMR, or is it gonna be exempt from being weighed into our EMR?
So right now, the COVID and those types of things are exempt from workers' compensation because it's an illness. I'm guessing as these changes come into place, that we're going to see workers' compensation, that it's not going to be exempt from that. So, yeah, as employers now, it's going to hit our rates.
Just one last question, unless anybody else has. You said that if we have company emails and it's under our company handbooks that they can't use company devices, again, union or non-union doesn't matter, but company, if it's in our handbook that you can only use company, or your company email for company business, I think I heard you say that they can use company emails for whether it be organizing or soliciting or other things. How is that possible?
That wasn't the case. That was in the past, Dan, where prior to this decision, that regardless of whether you had it in your handbook or not, the board took the position that unless you were really strict in your policing of it, I mean, you probably have employees who are, selling things online or sending things around to others or advertising at get-together parties, whatever the case may be. They're utilizing your email or internet to do shopping on, Cyber Monday or whatever the case. And if you're not enforcing that, the board basically took the position that if the union came in and wanted to utilize then your email, that the employees were entitled to do that, or the union was entitled to do that. Then we had this decision that said, no, that's not the case anymore, that the employer can strictly say, yeah, it's not entitled to be used for organizing activities or for labor activities. So that's where we'll see a change. I think it'll probably revert back to, again, and there's just no way, you're not in a position where you can hire somebody to police your IT, on a minute to minutes.
I'm not worried about my employees going out, I'm worried about the stuff that comes in.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the education. I want you to know that Chick-fil-A is looking better every minute you talk. So,
Thanks, Dan. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah, Tom?
This isn't local, but do you think Google will unionize?
Yeah, so I read that too, that it's interesting that Google is now, or that there's an employee group that is looking at unionizing there. So they have some pretty strict internal policies about what they can say and what they can do. And I would just guess, given the kind of makeup of their employee group, that they're not real excited about having those shackles placed on them. So I think you'll see a vote.
And that could spill over to Amazon and Facebook.
Absolutely, yeah. Walmart, I mean, all of these big groups now.
You know, one thing that I'll say is, you know, I think we have a decently strong culture in our company, but the one thing that all this stuff is gonna do, it's gonna flush out bad employers too. So I mean, the one negative, I don't want anybody telling me how to run my business, and I think the federal government wants to, right, which really pisses me off. But, and I'll just put it out there, but in the same aspect, I have a strong culture, which is a differentiation between me and the next contractor. But I think that this is going to flush out some of the bad actors, if you will.
Right.
So.
And I think it did, you know, in a lot of cases where we saw unions move in, I mean, it was because of employers that were taking advantage of employees or not doing things up to where they should have been in the first place, so. All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. Great information. Our next meeting will be February 23rd for our